All right, if you want to jump to Hebrews chapter 1, that's where we are at. And so we're in Hebrews 1. We've been talking about angels. Tim kind of started us off there, had some good conversations, some interesting things about angels, and we're going to continue on that. Let's see. I'm trying to see. So I think last week we went over one verse. Is that right, Tim?
Correct. We were blazing.
Yeah. So what we're going to do this week is, to make up for it, we're going to go through
Verse now.
nine verses.
Oh.
So I don't think we'll actually get through all of it, but I want us to kind of keep in context with this passage that we're going over. So we're going to read Hebrews 1:5-14, this whole section that the author is talking about angels and how Jesus is much better than angels. And then we'll start getting into it. I have to be honest, he quotes a lot of these passages, and myself, I just kept getting derailed because I'm like, I want to see what this passage is talking about and going over there. So we might do some of that today. We might only get through one verse, I don't know, but I want us to keep in context here. So is anyone up for reading verses 5-14?
I'll do it.
All right, Charlie, you're up, Charlie.
For to which of the angels did he ever say, "You are my son, today I have begotten you"? And again, I will be a father, and you shall be to me a son. But he again brings the firstborn into the world. He says, "Let all the angels of God worship him." And the angels, and to the angels, and of the angels, he says, "Who makes his angels spirits and his ministers a flame of fire." But to the Son, he says, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of righteousness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness more than your companions. And you, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will remain, and they will all grow like a garment. Like a cloak, you will fold them up, and they will be changed. But you are the same, for all your years will not fail. But to which of the angels has he ever said, "Sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool"? And are they not all ministering spirits sent forth to minister for those who will inherit salvation?
Oh man. Thank you, Charlie.
Yeah.
Good stuff. So we're getting into this, how Jesus is better than angels, and we talked a lot about angels and what they are. We're going to talk a little bit about that this week too, but we're going to just start off right there in verse 5. It says, "For to which of you did the angel..." Let me try that again. "For to which of the angels did he ever say, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you'? And again, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son." Wow, I don't know why I can't read today. But anyways, so this is where we are. This is the important thing that the author is trying to get past to us right here, is that Jesus is the Son of God, and the angels are not the Son of God. They're not the only begotten Son. There's a difference between them in that relationship. Why do you think it's important, or what's the big deal? What's a son have to do with anything? Why is a son better than a not a son?
Well, in that community, the Jews, they had God, and God was one, and so God really couldn't have a son, because how can God, who's not married, have a son if he's just God and he's one? And that's how the Jews saw it. I'm not saying that's how it was, but that's how the Jews saw it, that God was one and God couldn't have a son.
Okay. So But why is a son better than somebody who's not a son? So an angel would be like a servant, and
I
we'll
would-
talk about that a little bit more. But so why would a son be better than a servant?
Because he's directly related to you by blood.
Hmm.
And he's
Gets
part
a
of your
seat at the
family.
head table too. I'm sorry, John. Finish your thought.
Oh, no, I like what you said. He's got a seat at the table too. I'll steal that, Elijah. How about that?
I like that. Yeah, so it's important to realize that he's got a seat at the table. Yeah, I'm just taking Elijah's thing. But actually, this is a good point, right? There's a relationship difference between a son and a servant. And this is a one of those aspects that we don't want to miss, is that Jesus is a son. That means he has this relationship, this intimate relationship with the Father that others don't have, servants don't have. And so because there's this relational difference, he's better. He's got access to God in a way that the servants don't have access to him. And one of those, as you mentioned, Elijah and John, is that, he's got a seat at the table. That means he's there. Imagine if you had a son who lives with you versus if you have a servant who lives with you. If your servant comes and interrupts you, you might get really upset. If a son comes and interrupts you, you might be like, yeah, what's going on? Tell me what's going on with you. There's just a different relationship that's there between a son and a servant. And so that's one of those things that the author's trying to get past. That's one of the points he's trying to get to us here, is that Jesus is the Son of God. He's got a different relationship with God than the angels do, who are servants of him. All right,
And
so
I was going to say, and also in Jewish culture, firstborn son gets the majority of the inheritance and is considered above the others, and is almost equal to the father.
yeah, the father is prepping the son to take over, right? He's
Yeah.
not prepping any of the servants to take over, but he is the son. And so there's this big difference here. Now it's kind of different with Jesus because he is taking over already, but it's a good point, Bill. Thank you. So I want to look at this passage here. He says, for to which of you did the angels, to which of the angels did he ever say, you are my son, today I have begotten you? And your Bible might have a footnote and tell us where that quote is coming from. If not, this is from Psalms chapter 2, verses 7. And I'm trying to decide if I should, we'll talk about that in the next quote. So let's go to Psalms chapter 2 and take a look at this, where he says, you are my son, today I have begotten you. So that's Psalms 2.
Oh, 2:7, yeah.
So actually, let's read 1 through 8. Let's see. I'm going to ask Mr. Edwards, can you read verses 1 through 8? I'll catch you next time, Sean.
Did
Psalms
2,
chapter
sir.
2.
Psalm
1
chapter
through
2,
8.
1 through 8. Why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against the anointed, saying, let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall have them in derision, excuse me. Then shall he speak unto them in his wrath and vex them in his sore displeasure. Yet have I set my king upon the holy hill of Zion. I will declare the decree. The Lord hath said unto me, thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee. Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession.
All right. So who do you think this passage is talking about here? And there's some clues here. He talks about in verse 2, he says, against the Lord and against his anointed. Who do you think that anointed is?
His son.
Could be the nation of Israel, right? The Jews.
The Messiah. really. I mean,
Yeah.
it's the same word that's going to be used
Right.
later again and again. I mean, that's not the only clue, but generally speaking, I think it's the Messiah.
Yeah, so we've got this passage here, and if you look at the title of it in your Bible, it may even say, mine says the Messiah's triumph and kingdom. This passage here is about the Messiah, and it says the anointed one, which literally means that's what Messiah is. Or if we want to speak in Greek, that's the Christ. So that's where we get Christ and Messiah. They're the same word, but in different languages. And so this passage here is talking about the Messiah. And so this is cool because what we see is Jesus is the Messiah, right? He is that anointed one. That is one of his titles. And so what the author is doing is taking this passage that is clearly they would have understood is about this Messiah and said, this is who Jesus is. He's that Messiah. And so he's got this verse, this passage is talking about him. And there's some interesting aspects of this, right? It says in verse 2, the kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords from us. So we've got this interesting picture where we've got the Messiah. This is God's anointed one. This is the one to save man, and the kings and the rulers and the governments are against him. Does this sound like Jesus? Do you think any of the rulers and kings were against him? I'm going to go with a yes. But this isn't just this period of time that we know about Jesus, right? This is also future time. When Jesus comes back, we also know that the world's going to unite. The armies are going to unite, and the kings and the rulers are going to unite against Jesus. And what we see from this passage is that's not a good idea, right? Because it says in verse 4, he who sits in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall hold them in derision. Then he shall speak to them in his wrath and distress them in his deep displeasure. This is what happens when you come against the Lord, right? God's like, what are you thinking? And this is one of those things, even in that end times. I really like this picture when we look at Armageddon. Even then, all of mankind, all the armies, all the might of mankind is united against the Lord. And he's just going to come on his horse. He's going to be coming down to earth. And it's like, to him, this is just a laugh. Your guys's position is so weak, it's laughable. And we even know that he says, and we're told in Revelations, he opens his mouth and out comes a sword, and they're all gone. They're all dead. That's how powerful he is. That's how weak mankind is. But it's just interesting to see that this is not new. This is not something that God's going to be surprised by. He already knows. We shouldn't be surprised by it either. It's pretty interesting. And then on verse 7, he says, I will declare the decree. The Lord has said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask me, and I will give you the nations of your inheritance. And so I like this. This is the part that the author of Hebrews, he pulled out, was this, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. And so this is very clearly pointing out that the Messiah is special. He is different than other people because God says he is my begotten son. And we see that in the New Testament when Jesus says, this is my only begotten son. And then he says, listen to him, right? So this is really cool. This is God's always understood this. Man may not have understood it, but we can see, like as the author of Hebrews is pointing out, this is who Jesus is. He is the one and only Son of God. He calls him his son. He says, today I have begotten you. That's interesting. What do you think that means? Today I have begotten you. I like everything that has to deal with time. So to me, this one kind of jumped out, because there's this today aspect of it. So what do you think?
Hey, John.
Yeah.
Hey, can I read a verse?
We don't read verses here in the Bible of this study.
Hold
Yeah,
on.
go for it.
Thank you, sir. It because on my Bible it send me over to 2 Samuel 7.
Okay.
And then I was reading 14, but I like I'm gonna go from 11 or no. Yeah, 12. For when you die and you are buried. This is 1 Samuel or 2 Samuel 7, 12 through 16. For when you die, hold on. For when you die, you are buried with your ancestors. I will raise up one of your descendants, your own offering, or your own your own offspring, and I will make his kingdom strong. He is the one who will build a house, a temple for my name, and I will secure his royal throne forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. If he sins, I will correct and discipline him with the rod like any father would do. But my favor will not be taken from him as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from your sight. Your house and your kingdom will continue before me for all time, and your throne will be secure forever. Sorry, I
So-
just wanted to read that.
No, this is a good point, right? And this is some of why the Jews are thinking when the Messiah comes, he's going to be this powerful ruler. He's going to set up a kingdom, and nobody's going to be able to stand against him. And so this is some of that reasoning that they're seeing when Jesus comes. They reject him. He's like, but you're not overthrowing Rome. And this is also why when Jesus is questioned by Pilate, he says, my kingdom's not of this world. If it was, I'd ask them to come help me and they'd come fight. He says, but it's not. It's a different type of kingdom that he sets up. And it has to be a different type of kingdom because what you just read there, Jake, is that it's going to last forever. And
Mhm.
we're going to talk about that in a little bit too, in one of the passages that's quoted, but it's an important point. It's going to last forever. That does not sound like David, right? There's no
Mm-mm.
ruler of David that's
Mhm.
on earth that's ruling Israel right now. And so, you kind of like, well, what's going on? It's because he does have a ruler from a descendant that is a ruler, and that's Jesus, but it's a different type of kingdom. He does rule.
Mhm.
And there'll be a time where he's going to come and he's going to set it up here, and he's going to set up that new kingdom here, give us a new heaven and a new earth. And that's very exciting. But it's a good point, Jake. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, I just love that like part about, David, because as mighty as David was, it wasn't his anointing. It was always going to be the descendant of David, right?
Yeah.
And I just love how Jesus, the humility in Jesus, and then David in that verse,
Yeah. So I want to get back to this begotten part here. He says, today I have begotten you. And that begotten, right? That's this idea of birthed. I've brought you up. What do you think he's talking about? There's so many different ways I want to look at it, but I'm not sure it applies to to all of them, but it's just this cool idea. What do you think it means that today I have begotten you?
The quotation from Psalms like we just read. And it says just before this in Psalms, it says, I will declare and decree. So this is an announcement from God saying, today I want to decree. This is a law. This is something that cannot be changed. And so that's why he's saying, today, this is the point where I want you to make that it is a law. This is going to happen. So that's why it's today. I've always struggled with the part about begotten son, because we also teach and talk about how God the Father and God the Son are one, and they are not created beings. But when we say begotten, we are kind of talking about birth.
Yeah.
So, but I think what it's really saying is there is a hierarchy of the Trinity.
Yeah.
There's the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. And that is what I think this begotten means in this sense.
Okay.
But that's the SIV, the Sean inspired version.
there's so many cool aspects of that word begotten, right? Because we can talk about the birth of Jesus, but then again, like you said, Sean, people can get confused because it's not like Jesus didn't exist before that. He did. And so we don't want to say, maybe that's not it. In this context, it kind of sounds like he's saying this, he's doing this when Jesus sets up his kingdom here on earth, right? When the armies fight against him. And so there's that decree going out, this is my begotten son. But I like it because when we think of ourselves, we are born again, right? We had a second birth, and we're told we have to have a second birth. We have to have this rebirth in order to be a child of God. And so for me, I wonder if this begotten also talks about the resurrection of Jesus, because that's a completely different type of thing than what we think of as birth. But at the same time, he was dead and then he was alive. And to me, that sounds like a whole new life. So maybe it's a different type of birthing. I don't know. There's so many cool things about Jesus where you can look at in respect to birth and new life. It's just I like it.
In John,
Anybody have any? Yes,
Hey,
Jody, go
John-
for it.
in John 1:14,
Yeah,
says-
exactly.
it says it says that and we saw his glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. And I go to there, it says that there's a side note to the only begotten from the Father. It says unique, only one of his kind.
Yeah.
So that's what
Right.
begotten
Different
does.
than
Begotten
the
is
angels.
right.
That whole section right there, Jody, that's kind of what made me think of the resurrection, because it is talking about I don't know. We're gonna get off on a sidetrack. So I guess I have to reel myself back in. But go read John 1. That whole chapter is just amazing. I love it. All right. Let's see. Oh, I had one more point. Is that here? It does look like it. Let me just go back to it. So we're back in Psalms. I just want to bring up one more point, and that is verse 8. He says, ask of me, and I will give you the nations for your inheritance and the ends of the earth for your possession. And I just wanted to bring that up because what we see here is that God's plan for Jesus ruling, for the Messiah to rule, was not to rule just Israel. He says, ask and I will give you the nations. He's going to give Jesus the entire earth as his possession. He's going to give them to him as his inheritance. So that includes us, which is very exciting. I like that aspect of it. But it also just reminds us that this is all bigger than what we think, what the Jews thought, right? They were thinking the Messiah is going to come, set himself up as king over Israel. And here God is saying he's going to do more than that. He's going to be the king of the nations. So this is just this cool aspect that we see of Jesus, the Messiah. And again, he doesn't say any of this about angels. This is all in respect to the Messiah, Jesus.
That's kind of the difference between being a son is it makes you heir to the throne as opposed to just there.
And because we're talking God, who has the ultimate throne, right? He's the heir to all thrones. He's the one who gets to have them all. He gets to be in charge of everything. Good stuff.
It's interesting that when Jesus was tempted by an angel, that's exactly what he offered him.
Yeah, it is interesting, right? Because he knows he's going to get it, right? So it's like the Satan is saying, here's a shortcut. Here's how you can get to be there. I'll just give it to you right now. And Jesus is like, but I can wait and I can have it all. Maybe he didn't think that. Maybe he was just like, no, I'm following the Father. I'm doing what he told me to do. But it is interesting. All right, let's go back to Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 1. So we just did verse 5. Oh wait, no, we didn't do all of verse 5. So let's look at this next quote here. And this one's really interesting. So he says, verse 5, he says, for to which of the angels did he ever say, you are my son, today I've begotten you? And again, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. No, that's not the one either.
It says it twice.
He did say it twice. Okay, we're going to move to verse 6 because there's the quote that is in verse 6 is interesting here. In verse 6 it says, but when he again brings the firstborn of the world, he says, let all the angels of God worship him. And this is really interesting. If you look at your footnotes, this took me off on a wild tangent this last week. I'm just looking at all this. This is really interesting. And then I'm like, I don't know if there's a point here, but there is.
Yeah.
So we're going to go off a little bit on it. It's pretty cool. If you look at your footnotes for this verse, I'll see, this is interesting. I'm in a different version right now. And it says Deuteronomy 32:43 or Psalms 97:7. Is that what it says?
Yeah, that's what mine says too.
Yeah, Psalms 97:7. So it's either one of these verses, which is really interesting, because you'd be like, well, why can't you tell which verse it is if he quoted it? So this is why I want to back up just a little bit and discuss a little bit what the author is doing here. Well, author is writing to the Hebrews, right? That's the name of this book, Hebrews. But at this time in the world, the language that you speak to talk with everybody is Greek. And so our New Testament is mostly written in Greek. And so what they did is at that particular time, their Bibles were also in Greek, and they called those the Septuagint. So that's the Greek version of the Bible that they have. And so what we see here is he's making these quotations, but all these quotations are from the Septuagint. All right, so they're using the Greek. And I'm pointing this out because there's really something interesting here. And what we're going to see is we have things better. I don't want us to get confused and be like, oh man, this Bible is corrupted, I can't trust it. It's actually the opposite. I want to point out is we have things better now than they did hundreds of years ago. We have a much clearer picture of what the Bible says. We could be way more confident about it than what they could be back then. So the point I'm bringing up is, again, the author is using the Septuagint in his quotes. Now, if you went back a few hundred years to 1611, this is when they wrote the King James Version, when they translated it, compiled it. They only had a few sources to use for their Bible. And I can't remember for New Testament, I think it was 16, it might have been 20, somewhere between there. That's how many sources they had to compile and put this King James Version together. For the Old Testament, they used what was called the Masoretic text. And so there was this tradition of these Masoretes, and they would copy it. And they had this really good tradition of copying the Jewish canon, and they would make notes if they made mistakes. And so it could be really clear on what was going on. One of the problems, though, that developed was because the Masoretes were so good at copying, when a version got to be old, a document got to be old, they didn't want people misreading it or misunderstanding it. So who was the king? It was James, King James. So they didn't want to misread it. So what they did is they would destroy it. So they would have these old versions and they would destroy it, and then they would get a new version and they would keep this new copy, and the new copy was just as good as the old copy. So they didn't feel bad about doing this. But what that means is a lot of the old documents were destroyed. They don't exist anymore. But not 100%, because what's happened is through time, there have been discoveries where we have found some of these. And the Dead Sea Scrolls is a great example of that. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which some of those scrolls predate the Masoretic text, and you can actually see what they were using to copy. And for the most part, they agree completely. They're very, very similar, but there are some differences. And this quote that he's quoting is one of those differences. So it's really interesting. I find it interesting. So what we're going to see is he's using the Septuagint, which is a Greek copy of the Bible, and it's not fully a Masoretic text. So it's got something that's a little bit different than what you have. So if we have King James, does anybody reading King James or New King James? All right, I know you are, John. All right. Rich, you're shaking your head. You got King James. Can you read Deuteronomy 32:43?
Yep, hang on. Deuteronomy 32:43, New King James. Rejoice, O Gentiles, with his people. But I do have an asterisk talking about it. We'll talk about that later. For he will avenge the blood of his servants and render vengeance to his adversaries. He will provide atonement for his land and his people.
All right. So note that what the author of Hebrews did is he just quoted a passage about how the angels will worship him. And Rich just read verse 43, and the first time I read it, I'm like, I don't get it. Where's that at? And so I was digging into this, and this is why I think it's interesting. Who's got a different version? Does somebody else's version say something different?
Mine.
Yeah, what does yours say, Jake? What version do you have?
NIV.
Okay.
No,
trying to
NLT.
remember.
Sorry, NLT.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yep. Can you read it for us?
Yeah, mine's really long. Long compared to what Rich has said. Mine says, rejoice with him, you heavens, and let all of God's angels worship him. Rejoice with his people, you Gentiles, and let all the angels be strengthened in him. For he will revenge the blood of his children. He will take revenge against his enemies. He will repay those who hate him and cleanse his people's land.
All right. Thank you. That's perfect. So what we see is we have two different translations, and there's a little extra stuff that Jake's had. And the reason is because, again, New King James is based off the Masoretic text. And so it doesn't have, it's not using the Septuagint or the Dead Sea Scrolls from its, as the manuscripts that is used to translate. However, the NLT is using those other sources when it's translating. So it has this extra phrase in there. And I'm just pointing this out. This is just one of those cool things. Again, as we've gone through time, we can see, and there have been an argument of whether this phrase was added after the Masoretic text or before, and then they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, which predate it, and they're like, oh, it's before. And so now it's a lot clearer that somehow this ended up, when the scribes were copying it, somehow it just ended up getting lost. But we do have it because we have more to work with now, and we have better and more sophisticated tools for compiling this all together. So it's just really cool. I really like this. So we can see that if you were using the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Septuagint, you would see that that this passage has another phrase in it, and that phrase is what the author of Hebrews is possibly quoting. I say possibly because remember, when we looked at that footnote, it said Psalms 97 or Deuteronomy 32:43. So let's look at Psalms 97 real quick and see what that says. And here's another cool aspect of this, right? Because if we have two verses in the Bible that are saying basically the same thing, you can be pretty confident that that's what God is saying. Okay, so this is verse 97, verse 7, and I got to read it because I want to read it. It says, let all be put to shame who serve carved images, who boast of idols. Worship him, all you gods. That's what mine says in New King James. So we have this passage where we have, we have this author quoting a Old Testament verse. We're not sure, is it Deuteronomy or is it Psalms? They say something very similar, both of them do, particularly if you're using the Septuagint. So I want to share something with you real quick. And this is where, for me, this seals the deal on what we should think about this. So I'm sharing my screen. What we're looking at is Hebrews, Deuteronomy, and Psalms. And just that phrase in Deuteronomy that's from the Dead Sea Scrolls and from the Septuagint and some of the other sources. And we see the Psalms 97, just this phrase, and the Hebrews just in phrase, but it's all in Greek. Because remember, he's writing this, he's using the Septuagint Bible, he's using this Greek Bible. You can see just by looking at it, I don't know Greek, but I can tell which two of those match and which two of those don't match. Right? There's one that's a little bit different than the others, and that's the Psalm 97 one. But if you look at the Greek, they're identical from Hebrews 1:6 to that phrase in Deuteronomy 32:43. So people may argue about it, which one he's quoting, but the reality is if you use the Septuagint, the Greek Bible that he's using to quote everything, it's identical. So to me, it seems pretty clear he is quoting Deuteronomy 32:43. Let me stop sharing my screen. Now I got to figure out how to stop. There. All right.
Two things with that is, you notice in the Bible I'm using, it's New King James, they don't even quote the Psalm. They
Oh,
don't use
really?
it as a footnote. They use
Oh,
just
okay.
Deuteronomy. Second thing is that I love about this, it says, let all the angels of God worship him.
Yeah.
And I like that because what happened with the birth of Jesus is that
Yeah.
a host of angels came down to the shepherds and were worshiping God, the Son on earth. And it says, when he is first born in the world, he says, let all the angels worship him. And I think that's pretty cool because it did happen, and it's something that's looking forward.
I think you hit it right on the nail right on the head, right? That it's just this cool thing. And again, this is what the author of Hebrews is trying to convey, that the Son is different than the angels because God says, let the angels worship the Son. And that never happens the other way around. There's never this, okay, Jesus, you need to worship the angels. But there is this, hey, angels, you need to worship the Son. And you have a great example there. I want to point out one other thing from this passage that I think is really cool. So if we want to jump real quick to Deuteronomy 32:43, is anybody reading an ESV?
I am.
Mark, could you read Deuteronomy? We're going to do it one more time. Read Deuteronomy 32:43.
Yeah, 32:43.
That's right.
Rejoice with him, O heaven. Bow down to him, all gods, for he avenges the blood of his children and takes vengeance on his adversaries. He repays those who hate him and cleanses his people's land.
All right. So there's one other aspect of this verse that I want us to catch here. And this is in some of the translations, it says gods, and some of the translations, it says angels. And I'm bringing this up because I've mentioned this before. We have this oversimplistic view of angels. We think angels is this supernatural being that God created, and we call them angels, except when we call them demons, or we call them something else. We call them seraphim or cherubim, right? So actually, scratch that whole thing, right? That's not what an angel is. And we've talked about this a little bit, how an angel is a messenger. That's what the word angel literally means. In both the Old Testament and in the New Testament, when it says angels, most of the times that word means messenger. But here in this verse, it doesn't mean messenger, right? It's something a little bit different. It says in the ESV, it's translated as gods. And we could argue whether or not it should be gods or angels, but I think it comes down to the fact that we have this view of what an angel is, and we don't like this term gods because then it sounds like polytheism. And so we forget gods, we're going to go with angels. But I just want to bring it up because for two reasons. One, the Jews had a different perspective of all of this, and it wasn't polytheism. They were monotheistic. They did have this idea that there was one and only one true God, but then they also had these terms that they would throw around for gods. And that sounds conflicting, but it's not, because in their view, there is only one who is self-sufficient. There's only one who is self-reliant and self-existing, and that is Yahweh. And that's what they call God. But they did recognize that there are other beings that exist that are not human, and they're not God, Yahweh, but they were called gods. And so I'm just bringing this up. There's this other view of other beings that they've called gods, but they're not Yahweh. And so again, it's not polytheism because they don't believe that any of those are self-existing. Their existence is all dependent on Yahweh. So they're not in the same boat. So they have this view of other beings. And what do we call them? We call them angels, but they might not have called them angels because there's a recognition here that an angel is a messenger, and they might not all be messengers, right? If you're a demon, you're not a messenger of God, at least. So there's this idea here. And the reason that I think this is so cool is because this verse includes all beings when it says this. It's not just the messengers, it's not just the angels. And Sean brought up this great example of when the angels are bowing down and worshiping him. But we also see this includes others. This includes those who aren't angels, those who are beings that aren't human. I don't know what to call them. We just call them angels, but I don't know what to call them. We don't have a good word for it. So I'm just bringing this up because this is cool that this verse is telling us that all beings that aren't human, they're going to have to worship God as well. So we see that when we're told that when Jesus comes, every head will bow and every knee confess that Jesus is the Lord, we're not limiting that to every human. We're not limiting that to every angel. We're limiting that to every being who's not God is going to have to confess and recognize that Jesus is God. I don't know. What do you guys think about this? I like this whole thing. I had fun doing research on this and looking at this, but I don't know. What do you think?
I think it really helped me out because as everyone was reading their version, I was in the ESV and it just says all gods. And I'm like, wait, guys, it says all gods. So I was always going, but you were saying angels. I'm like, well, wait, God, but it says here, God. So it's more of a comprehensive. It's basically, if you're not God, if you're not God, I'm speaking to you.
Yeah.
It's not limited.
That's right. And again, we don't want to get confused and think that there's this concept that there's other God. They do have this concept that there are other beings that are more powerful than humans, and they roam the earth and they have power and they have authority. They may even be false gods, which are beings that claim to be God and getting others to follow them, but they're not Yahweh. None of them are self-existent.
Also notice that it's the small g on the gods.
Yeah.
It's not the big G.
Yeah.
And so the other thing is that Jesus quotes also that, aren't we all called gods? And so this does bring up that it's all inclusive of everything that was created, that it's all inclusive in that. The other thing is that you notice that whenever angels did show up to the Jews or to anyone else, they worshiped them. And they were considered gods. And that's where Greek mythology and all this other stuff that came in is these angels, whether they be demons or whatever, set themselves up as being gods and they were worshipped. But it was in here, it's just all inclusive, that word gods. So I think it's interesting. It's kind of scary, but it's interesting. And that's where a lot of people misuse the Bible in thinking that we too could become God.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah. No, go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say, I mean, the other references, of course, are in Genesis 6 and I think in Job as well, right? When the sons of God,
Yep.
gathered in heaven. But that makes it really interesting because, the one thing we didn't touch earlier was Hebrews 11, I think, when it talks about, Abraham having sons, but yet Isaac was the only son. It was really, really, I mean, his begotten son. And I think Hebrews 11. So again, there's a uniqueness of Isaac to Abraham because the promise came through him and God made clear of that. And now you get Jesus. It's the same thing. I mean, you can have all kinds of different titles. We're all children of God. We're all sons of, and people want to argue that. But I think, again, the author of Hebrews is trying to get to the fact that there's only one begotten son of God. And there's a uniqueness, and John touched on it earlier. But I think it's also a play on these words that people have this idea, hey, maybe there's some equality or some similarness, and Jesus is just one of them, but he's the greatest of them. But that's not the point. He's the only. I mean, there's a title, there's a uniqueness, there's a special quality, of course, because he's the Son of God, literally. And that's it's amazing when we think about it just in that context. I think cool stuff.
It is. I agree. This is all cool. And it's just keeps reinforcing to me this idea that sometimes language just doesn't have a good way of describing what God is. He's just so unique, so different. And we can get caught up in some of the language that we use and mislead other people with that language when we miss the point, which is the point here that, again, that the author is making, is that he's not an angel. He's better than the angels. He is different. He is God. He's the Son. He's the firstborn. I like all of that. And again, firstborn. So we're back in Hebrews 6. It says, but when he again brings the firstborn into the world, he says, let all the angels of God worship him. So again, there's this point where he calls him the firstborn, but this is talking about rank and authority and primarity. That's not the right word I'm looking for, but it's talking about how he is the firstborn in what's the word I'm looking for?
Preeminent?
Yes. And he's just the most important, right? He's the first of all of them. But we get this idea of firstborn. Well, that means he was born first. And that's not what this is saying, right? It's not saying that he was born first, because we actually know he was actually born, when Jesus was born, that was 2,000-ish years ago. And there was a lot of people born before him. Adam was firstborn. He was born first. But again, he's firstborn in this nature that we have until we're born again. And then we're born in this other nature. And Jesus is the first of that other nature. He's the first of this nature of where we can have fellowship with God. We can escape this rebellion that man has out of God. And now I'm starting to get off again. I want to go into the gospel and talk about how, Jesus saves us. This is all amazing, great stuff. But I just want to bring that up. He says he's the firstborn into the world. We don't want to get confused and think he's saying that he was born first, because really what we've learned about Jesus is that he created the world, right? He's the creator of everything. In John 1, everything that was made from him. And so it is again this thing that I've been mentioning several times, which is God existed and then he was born, unlike us where we're born and then we feel like we exist. And so he doesn't follow that same pattern as everyone else, because he's not like everyone else. Well, we only have 4 minutes left, and that's not enough time to tackle the next verse, because I was totally confused by this next verse for a while. So does anybody have anything else they want to add or bring up before we close it out?
Well, this whole first chapter of Hebrews just seems to be really emphasizing that Jesus was not just a good man, that he was not just an angel, but that he was something far greater than all of that, and that he was God. And I think that's what whoever wrote Hebrews was trying to get across to the Jewish nation at that time, that
Yeah.
Jesus was God, that he was more than a good teacher or a wise man or a son of Joseph or whatever.
And this is a good point for us to remember and to bring it back to the book of Hebrews, where this is a time when the Jews are starting to get persecuted. The Christians, I'm sorry, are starting to get persecuted. And some of them are thinking, well, if I reject Jesus and go back to the law of Moses and follow these things, or if I reject Jesus and follow these angels, or if I reject Jesus and follow something else, that it'll be better because there won't be as much persecution. And the author here is saying, don't do that. None of them are as good as Jesus. You want to follow Jesus because he is better than all of these things. And he's going to lay out some more things that Jesus is better than. But we just want to keep that on point, that we want to follow Jesus, because no matter what you try to point us to, none of it is as good as him. None of it's as powerful as him. None of it's as, I want to say good, because that's the word that I like, good. But none of it compares to Jesus.
And John, to your point, it almost seems like we're behind the scenes. We're the jury, and we're at a trial, and the case is being made for Jesus, and all of their information that he's presenting is trying to get it into our terms, or even during the time, and we're sitting there, and he's trying to use all the vernacular and examples for us to kind of really, really hone in, and we're kind of behind those scenes, and the presentation is being presented. It is fun. It is fun. It's interesting. Again, using terminology as firstborn, begotten, all these terms that could capture us and get us to really understand who Jesus truly is, so that we can have that confidence, so we can endure that race, that we can continue to do the fight. And so it's interesting. I'm kind of like waiting for what's the next hook, for lack of a better word, or next trailer to get me to the next step. Like, oh man, I never thought about that as well. That's great. That's a great not strategy, but I mean, if you're in a trial, that is a great strategy. But it's captivating.
And it's also future proofing us from other arguments and other things that might come in. And at this time, there weren't other Judeo-Christian type of religions like there are now. Now there's a whole bunch of different sects of people who call themselves Christians, but they're following other things, right? They might be putting a lot of preeminence on Mary, like she's the firstborn. But again, this book of Hebrews is saying, no, Jesus is the firstborn. And so there's it for sure future proofs us from all of these other arguments of yeah, that's good, but look at these angels, they're really cool and powerful, so let's go and follow them. And we're reminded, no, don't do that, it's not worth it.
And I also like that Paul, when he went to the synagogues and was convincing the Jews who Christ was, they didn't have the New Testament like we do.
Yeah.
They had only the Old Testament. And so that's what he would use, is the Old Testament to argue. And that's what I love about these things. This part of it is, in their references, they're always pointing back to the Old Testament. This is what God said back in Deuteronomy, back in Psalms. And so it's neat that we can see and go back, and everything relates to Jesus. We have a class in the school called the History of Redemption. And basically it goes through every book of the Bible and shows where Christ is in every book of the Bible. And it's that history of redemption and pointing back to the Old Testament.
Sounds like fun. I've done that once, and it's incredible to see he's everywhere. Yeah, it's good stuff. Well, we are out of time. So let's see. Who would like to close us out in prayer this morning?